Did you know that Sega has more or less been using the same 3D Sonic model for 20 entire years straight? They can't keep getting away with this. One of the coolest things about Sonic is that he's been around to see it all. That's right, he knows what you did on October 14th, 2015. No, I'm mainly talking about the evolution of video games. Since the fairly early days of gaming, back when you could only fit a handful of pixels on the screen at once, artists have tried their hardest to depict Sonic in the best, most stylish way possible. Over the years, the medium of video games would evolve, and in turn, so would Sonic. He would eventually make the jump into 3D, but not just in terms of gameplay, graphically as well. And from that point on, Sonic's look would continue to evolve with not only technology, but the artistic taste of the time, with each game usually giving its own subtle take on the iconic design. Usually. But not all of Sonic's 3D models are created equal. The average Joe Schmo would probably think designing a 3D model off of the same guy would give more or less the same results every time, but this is far from the truth. Some models manage to beautifully translate his 2D design into 3D pretty dang faithfully, and others, yeah, you know. Welcome to chaomix, and today we'll be taking a look at the best and worst of Sonic's 3D models and ranking them on a tier list. A few ground rules. 1. We'll only be ranking in-game models. No pre-rendered images or models, like from the title screens of the classic games, or CGI models used in the intro sequences, like the Sonic Unleashed opening. 2. I'll be grouping models that are similar enough together so we aren't being too redundant. Because as we'll see as we get pretty deep into it, there's a lot of models that are near identical. 3. Rankings will not be based on fidelity, so how low or high poly they are won't factor into their rankings. After all, it's totally possible to make a good-looking model with a low number of polygons, as we'll surely see later in this video. And 4. Rankings will be based on how on-model they each are to Sonic's original 2D design philosophies. And with all that being said, let's go over to our first 3D model. The first ever game to include a fully playable 3D version of Sonic would be Sonic the Fighters, all the way back in 1996. This was an arcade game, which tended to have a lot more hardware power than home consoles. So for the time, this was considered extremely high poly. One little detail that I actually love, that I think really makes this model stick out among a lot of the others, is the lack of smooth shading. You can actually see all of the individual polygons. It's a really unique look. But in terms of Sonic's actual model, I think he looks absolutely fantastic here. He's got a great figure 8 shape for his eyes, his muzzle properly curves up and down, his quills and ears are nice and pointy. These are all some of the things I think make for an ideal Sonic model, and you'll keep hearing me mention some of these specific qualities as the video continues. But yeah, this is a solid model for something this early on. My one complaint is that proportionally, I think he's just a bit too lanky for classic Sonic's design. Just a little bit. However, I do totally get why they did this. This is a fighting game after all. Trying to animate a character with stubby limbs with a bunch of punches and kicks would have been absolute hell. The lankiness gives these characters the extra functionality to perform these crazy moves. But anyways, overall, the Sonic the Fighters model is an extremely strong start. This first one setting the bar pretty high and going into the A tier. Now, remember when I said that arcade machines had more power than home consoles? Well, we're about to see a very real-ass example of that right now. Because in the following year, Sonic Jam and Sonic R would release on the Sega Saturn using very similar models to each other. And yeah, we'll be lumping these two games' models in with each other. Compared to Sonic the Fighters, this model is very obviously much lower fidelity. However, I really think they made it work given their limitations. For example, I think the lower poly look actually does Sonic a huge favor. I'm a really big fan of how pointy this model is. It really emphasizes Sonic's literal edge. Like, if this guy came at me rolled up in a ball, I'd definitely be scared of him slicing me in half. You're actually able to play as this model in Sonic X Shadow Generations, and something about it just feels right. I guess my biggest nitpick is that his eyes don't have a great figure 8 silhouette, and I think overall his face is a bit too big. It wraps around his face a bit too widely. So sure, his face is kinda weird and his hands look like popsicles, but come on, he can't help it. This is a really charming low poly model, and I think it deserves a spot in the B tier. For this next one though, I'm not sure if I can say the same. This one's kind of a deep cut, released about a year before Sonic Jam and Sonic R. Sonic Team's other game, Nights into Dreams, had a Christmas-themed demo called Christmas Nights into Dreams. Go figure. And in this little game, you could play as Sonic. This would actually be Sonic's playable debut on the Sega Saturn. Now, don't get me wrong, this is some neat trivia, but we're here to talk about 3D Sonic models. And unfortunately for the blue little guy, it ain't looking so hot for him. Looking past his dead expression, for some reason he has this strange metallic bevel around his eyes and muzzle. It looks like someone stamped a huge inset in his face to create the space for his eyes. Probably one of the more strange design choices out of every Sonic model in this list, if I'm being real. But proportionally, I honestly think it's pretty solid. It's very similar to the Sonic Jam model. And he does have a pretty nice figure 8 shape to his big ol' mono eye. He isn't the worst model on this list, but he's definitely far from good. This guy's being sent into the D tier. Now, before we continue, I'd like to take a second to shout out the sponsor of today's video, Cook Unity. Cook Unity delivers fresh, chef-crafted meals right to your door, giving you a taste of restaurant-quality dishes without ever having to leave your home. It really comes in clutch when I'm absolutely swamped with work, between programming for Star Garden, the video game I'm making available to Wishlist now on Steam, and making some insane video about the lore of Sonic's quill length or whatever hyperfixation I'm on for that week. But it's not just about convenience, it's about variety. With over 400 meals to choose from, you'll never get bored. Whether you're vegan, gluten-free, or just a food lover like me, there's something for everyone. The best part? These meals are created by chefs from some of the best restaurants across the country. Last night I had a Mission-style carnitas burrito by Chef Jose Garces, and it was so good. I'm definitely going to be craving this one again. But what might be even more crazy is that Cook Unity can be cheaper than groceries, especially if you're just cooking for yourself. So save time, save money, and eat like a VIP diner with Cook Unity. Try Cook Unity today with the link in my description and use code chaomix for 50% off your first order. Huge thank you to Cook Unity for sponsoring today's video, and with all that being said, let's continue with today's episode. Sonic Adventure's model is next, and this is where Sonic's entire look gets a soft reboot. But don't worry, this isn't the last we'll be seeing of classic Sonic. Sonic's redesign in Adventure would give him lankier limbs, longer quills, and greener eyes. So how did Sega treat Sonic's 3D model for this exciting new design? Honestly, it's pretty good. And you know what? This is very on model. It's just not on model to the correct design. Sure, he has green eyes, but you know what? This is a near perfect one-to-one translation of Sonic's sprites from Sonic 3 and Knuckles. You can really see it looking at them side by side. This is modern Sonic, but with classic Sonic proportions. And I think this may be a byproduct of Adventure originally using Sonic's classic design early on in production. So unfortunately, he gets some points off for the proportions being off from Uekawa's new designs. But regardless, this is still one of my favorite Sonic models. His head has a certain roundness to it, with his quills perfectly keeping that flow and curving down in a really satisfying way. His cheeks are kinda chubby, which makes him look a little bit fat, but his eyes have such a good figure 8 shape. And I think with it being lower poly, like I mentioned before, it gives Sonic more of a literal edge. On top of that, I think the lower poly nature allows your brain to fill in some of the gaps with your imagination. Despite the nitpick on his proportions, Adventure Sonic is going up into the A tier. Now, I said I'd group similar models, but Sonic Adventure DX has its own completely revamped model, despite being a port of the same game. Definitely different enough to warrant its own category, I'd say. The thing is, this model does things better than the original, but also worse. For instance, I absolutely love the more hot dog-shaped shoes, and overall, his body proportions are more lanky, much more faithful to Uekawa's Adventure design. But you can really tell that this is a different model with the face. I think for consistency's sake, they tried to make it match closer to the model from Sonic Adventure 2, which we'll be looking at very shortly. But there's something about it that's kind of off. I think it comes down to 3 main things. 1. A weak muzzle curve, leading to the eyes having less of a figure 8 silhouette. You can see the curvature is more leveled out or flat over here. 2. Once again, I think his cheeks go out a bit too wide, making his face look kind of chubby. And 3. His muzzle protrudes out too much in front of him. Basically, all of his nitpicks relate to his muzzle. This is due to the muzzle not following something I'll be calling circle theory, which is a concept I totally took inspiration from Twitter user Sock Tiger, who makes these awesome threads about 3D Sonic models. I absolutely love these threads, by the way, keep it up. I realized over the course of making this video that every single model that I love happened to follow a set of guidelines. Circles, to be exact. The way to use circle theory is to see how aligned Sonic's facial features are by attempting to see how they fit into a series of circles. Let's use the original Adventure model as an example, since it actually follows these guidelines almost perfectly. First, Sonic's side profile should fit as much onto the circle as possible, with his facial features protruding in or out only very little to not offset this shape too much. Obviously, not everything is going to be flush with the circle. but having one feature protrude in or out too much is going to make Sonic's face look off-model. This is basically the equivalent of mewing in the Sonic universe. But second, his inner face should also ideally follow two circles, with the inner circle containing his big mono eye, and the outer circle following the bottom of his muzzle with his ears starting on the outside. Using the original Adventure model, we can see how it perfectly follows both the side profile and front inner two circles. That's why he looks so good, hence circle theory. And with the DX model, yeah, now you can definitely see how off this is, both on the side and in front. The more the features creep out of the circle, the more oblong Sonic's face feels. So to fix it, I'd make a few small tweaks, like rotating Sonic's ears to point a bit more outward and pushing in his muzzle. But overall, this model is worse in some areas compared to the original Adventure model, but slightly better in others. In the end, I think this one is slightly worse, putting it into the B tier. Now, for completionist's sake, I do want to include Sonic Shuffle. Because yes, while it does use the same model from Adventure in its cutscenes, but cel-shaded, it actually has a lower quality model used during gameplay. Now, I know I said I wouldn't be factoring in graphical fidelity into these rankings, but the way this model is shaped, particularly in the face, commits several crimes in my eyes. First of all, his big mono eye shape is super weird. Definitely doesn't follow along Circle Theory's inner circle. You can see the sides of his eye shape just stop being circular and go straight up and down at one point. And his iris texture is oddly soulless. Thus, he looks ugly. That's really it, honestly. Goes to show how important the shape of Sonic's face is, I guess. I'm throwing this poor guy into the D tier. Alright, let's finally talk about Sonic Adventure 2's model. I'll be lumping Adventure 2 Battle's model in with this one since they're so similar. Battle is just higher poly. Unlike Adventure and DX, Adventure 2 was created from the start with Uekawa's Sonic design in mind. It does almost everything correctly and is extremely faithful to his vision for the character. First off, Sonic looks very proportionally similar to how he does in the key art for the game. Super on point here. He's got a more almond-shaped torso, making his chest puff out more. I don't know, it just makes him look more confident like he is in the Adventure art. There's good taper on both his arms and his legs, making them thicker as they go down. He has super long and pointy ears, which add to the spiky nature of the character. His quills have a very even distribution and flow. Great muzzle curve, giving his eyes a perfect figure 8 shape. Prominent upper brow. His side profile is near perfect, with his muzzle not protruding out too much, very snug to the center of his face. And his front view face almost perfectly aligns with the two inner circles of Circle Theory. I really can't find much wrong with this model, unless you aren't a fan of the soap shoes. But to be fair, the Sonic Adventure 2 trial demo has Sonic using his normal shoes, and I do kinda be liking how hot doggy these guys are. But anyways, wow. This is a goddamn S tier model if I've ever seen one. This next Sonic model is used in both Sonic Heroes and Shadow the Hedgehog, so these games are being lumped together. Now, this is a super cool model and seems to have set the foundation for a bunch of future models, which I'll talk about when we get to. But I think they were going all in on trying to translate Uekawa's designs into the games here. Every character is very stylized in this game, whereas Adventure 1 and 2 actually went for photorealistic textures, or at least as photorealistic as you can get for the Dreamcast. For example, there's minimum textures for a character's fur or baked-in lighting. They also have very cartoonish iris textures. Another thing I noticed is that Sonic's quills are a bit more stiff than Adventure 1 and 2's, as they don't droop down as much. He's also got this more aggressive expression in this game compared to Adventure 2. Maybe because this is the first game to actually 3D model his butt brow. But I think the real reason for his RBF is actually because if you look at the inner circle here, his eyes kind of slant outwards, leaving the circle. But honestly, my biggest nitpick is that every character in this game, including Sonic, is really shiny, like they were lathered up in olive oil. I guess what they were trying to do is replicate the rim lighting in Uekawa's art. Cool idea in theory, but kinda misses the mark in this particular execution. But really, it's an easy fix, just turn the roughness value all the way up to make them more matte. Nonetheless, this is a solid B tier model. Next up is a model very similar to the Heroes one. This one is from Sega Superstars. Yeah, that weird PS2 game for the iToy. In fact, it's basically a higher poly version of the Sonic Heroes model, but there are a few key differences that make a world of difference. I noticed that his spikes are a bit less rigid, they droop down a bit more, similar to Sonic Adventure 2's model, and his expression is a little bit less angry, as the shape of his eyes are more horizontal rather than diagonal like the Heroes model. See, it doesn't leave the Circle Theory's inner circle. Everything aligns perfectly. Also, he doesn't have the butt brow the other one had. To me, this basically looks like like a mix of the best parts of Adventure 2's model with the best parts of the Heroes model, and I kind of love it. But one of my favorite details is that the mouth is a texture. With mouths being textures, you're able to do some really fun stuff, like this 2D Uekawa style smile. This needs to be normalized for more models, like immediately. Yeah, this might actually be one of my favorite Sonic models ever. This is another S tier. It's time to go low poly once again. Sonic Rush, Rush Adventure, and Colors all have pretty similar models. There are some differences, but we'll be grouping them together for convenience sake. By the way, don't mind the amalgamation of hands, he just has a lot going on in his life right now. Just to get it out of the way, I slightly prefer the original Rush model over its future iteration, so we'll be using this one. The main difference is that the separation between his eyes and his brow is actually 3D modeled rather than a 2D sprite texture. Anyway, Sonic's head once again follows the circle theory quite nicely, and his proportions are all in check. Long quills, decent head to body size ratio, hot doggy shoes. They managed to do a lot with this with a limited amount of polygons. My biggest feedback is that I would probably make the head a bit smaller, but maybe because this was meant to be played on a tiny DS screen, they wanted to make sure his head was extra visible. He's definitely one of the more adorable models on this list. Could be because I'm a pretty big sucker for low poly though. In a way, I see this guy as the Sonic Jam model's modern brother. The Sonic Rush models deserve its spot in the B tier. The Sonic Riders model is another one stylized in a similar way to Heroes, but the proportions are all jumbled around. His head is extremely small compared to his body. His quill length is off the charts. The thin to thick taper on his arms and legs is extremely exaggerated. His torso looks like it was stretched vertically, and he has huge hands and feet. This is a super weird model. It reminds me of some of the Sonic Archie comic art styles where they started making the proportions more humanly. In some ways, yeah, I guess it kinda looks cool. I do like the crazy long and exaggerated quills, and in a lot of ways, this model refines some of the facial features from the Sonic Heroes model. Respect for the stylization, but yeah, I don't think I'd ever see these proportions as ideal for a Sonic model. This one is going into the C tier. Sonic 06 may be an unfinished, broken game that almost killed the entire franchise, but I gotta say, damn, all of these character models go hard. Forget Sonic for a second, Shadow and Silver look amazing in this game too. But we're here to talk about Sonic, so let's get back on track. I don't care what anyone says, this is a fantastic model for Sonic. I especially love the way his face is modeled. He's got the perfect eye shape that curves along his muzzle. Besides his ears, his entire face follows the curvature of both the inner and outer circle almost perfectly. Now, I would change a few things. I'd probably make the ears bigger, rotate them a bit more outwards so they follow the outer circle's curvature more. I'd make his body a bit more round and less tall. I'd reduce his leg length as he's a bit too tall in my opinion, and I'd make his quills less stiff and have more of an even taper on them. That's what I would do to make him perfect. But regardless, this is an A tier model. Next up is Secret Rings, which is an absolutely fantastic and underrated model. Proportionally, this is probably one of the most perfect on this list. I love his fur texture, and the colors are vibrant but not overly saturated. His face follows the inner two circles of circle theory almost perfectly. However, I do have a complaint that I think makes Sonic's face a tad bit weird. His muzzle curve is a bit too aggressive in my opinion. Yeah, you probably thought you'd never hear me say that. Specifically the part in the center where his nose is. I think positioning the peak of it a bit lower would help a lot. I also think making Sonic's irises a bit thinner would be really cool. They're kinda wide on this model. Otherwise, this is an A tier model. Sonic and the Black Knight is the other on-rails Wii game, but despite the similar gameplay, it actually uses a somewhat different model, even disregarding the giant Knight Gauntlet. His body and head are basically exactly the same, but this model modifies a few things from the Secret Ring model's face. One thing this model does that I like is make Sonic's irises thinner, similar to how I modified them in the Secret Rings model. However, where the other model had an overly aggressive muzzle curve, this one has the opposite problem. It's kinda shallow and doesn't really emphasize the figure 8 shape on Sonic's eyes as good as it should. If I were to fix this, I'd essentially just exaggerate the muzzle curve ever so slightly, like an in-between of this and the Secret Rings model. Oh, and fun fact, this model is the same one from the Sonic and Mario at the Olympic Games series and Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Well, minus the gauntlet, obviously. So yeah, think of all these guys as brothers. But all in all, despite the small differences in the muzzle compared to the Secret Rings model, this is a great one. So great that they decided to reuse it in like every Wii Sonic game, I guess. I'm putting this one right next to the Sonic and the Secret Rings model in the A tier. What the f am I looking at? Okay, this is probably the ugliest model on this entire list. Meet the Sonic Chronicles model. Granted, it's for a DS game, probably the weakest hardware-wise on this list, But Sonic Rush was also on the DS, and that was one of the higher ranking ones. This guy doesn't have any excuse. It's like they looked at Sonic once and tried to recreate him from memory. Because why is he shaped like that? This is like what Knuckles looked like in Sonic Boom, Jesus. Definitely didn't skip shoulder day. Yeah, his quills are really droopy, his eyes are way too big, his ears are a bit small and should be rotated a bit more outward. His cheek lifts right off his face way too much. There's so many things wrong with this model, you guys. I'm sending this one into the Shadow Realm in the F tier. Remember in the beginning of the video where I said that Sega has been using the same model for the past 20 years? Well, this is the culprit. This is the trademarked modern Sonic model. Technically, this model debuted in the Shadow the Hedgehog opening cinematic and promotional renders. You can find them right here in this game's instruction manual. But in terms of this model actually being used in-game, we'd have to wait a few years for the technology to handle this super high poly model. Its first major in-game appearance would be Sonic Unleashed, but this would be far from his last. This model would be used in practically every game after. Sonic 4 Episodes 1 and 2, Sonic Colors, Sonic Generations, Sonic Lost World, practically every single spin-off game. This model is even used in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, I kid you not. And it still gets used to this very day. However, in some cases, it's been slightly modified, so we'll be talking about that version in its own category later on. But yeah, these are all just in-game uses. Don't even get me started on how this is straight up just used across the entire board for basically every character render or promotional key art. But I digress. Anyways, what's actually even wrong with this model? Well, it's mostly all in the face. Everything else is pretty par for the course, I guess. Without holding back, I think his hands might be a bit too big, his shoes have lost all hot dogginess, they look like metallic clothing irons, which is pretty lame, but overall his body shape and proportions are decent. His quills are nice and long, which I do tend to like, and one thing I notice is that it uses nearly the exact same quills from the Sonic Heroes model. I think they were literally borrowed from it. Actually, there's some suspicion out there that the modern Sonic model is actually just an upscaled Sonic Heroes model, and I can kind of see it. If we use the circle theory on his face, we can see that the modern Sonic model's big mono eye falls outside of the inner circle exactly how the Sonic Heroes model did. There are some pretty big differences from the Sonic Heroes model still, I'd say, like this weird almond-shaped inner ear. Ideally, this should be more of a concave shape versus a convex shape. It should basically curve inward, not outward. Also, his muzzle sits so far off his face. This looks like a piece of Sonic you can just peel off. It's really weird. And where Adventure Sonic's cheeks go too far out, this one doesn't go out far enough. For the love of God, put some meat on this guy's bones. This is Sonic on Ozempic. This isn't a bad model, but it isn't good. And here's the thing. If Sega is gonna reuse the same model for 20 years, I'd rather it be one of the A or S tier ones, you know? The issue is that we've been stuck with it for 20 years, and it's extremely mid. But despite my bias, which is I'm super sick of it and never want to see it again, I think this one is at the very least a C tier. Hey, remember Classic Sonic? Well, he returns in Sonic Generations and Forces. The models are similar enough to group them together, so let's take a look at his Generations model since it happens to be the one I have on hand. Now, off the bat, this Sonic looks kinda soft, like he's a little bit too friendly, he's got no edge. And I'd say a big reason is that he's so stubby and chubby. I know I said the Sonic the Fighters model was a bit too tall, but like, look at the difference here. I think he could benefit from being a bit taller, but hey, so could I, am I right? I also think his stomach is a bit too large. If modern Sonic is on Ozempic, then this guy definitely isn't watching his calories by any means. It's an okay model, but the funny thing is I prefer playing as the Sonic Jam model in Sonic X Shadow Generations. Even though he's lower poly, he just feels more authentic Classic Sonic than this vanilla Classic Sonic model. I'm putting Generations Classic Sonic into the C tier. We've got another classic Sonic for you with the Sonic Mania Special Stage model. Now, right off the bat, this guy kind of looks like the Sonic R model. And from behind, yeah, he definitely does. But if we take a closer look, we can see some details that, in my opinion, are pretty inaccurate to the era it's trying to replicate. First, he probably wouldn't have such detailed hands. And by detailed, I mean him having an individual thumb. Nah, there's no such thing as fingers where this guy would be from. Next, his eye definitely wouldn't be a modeled mesh. This would 100% be a texture on a flat plane if this was actually made during the era this game is trying to emulate. Same goes for his belt buckle, not sure why they actually 3D modeled it. Now, his legs are longer than Gen's classic Sonic, which is good because I think proportionally this model is pretty solid. But yeah, he's kind of just the Sonic R model, but more soulless. They honestly should have just used that model here. I don't think anyone would have minded. This one is going into the C tier. Okay, remember when I said that there was a revision to the modern Sonic model? Well, from Forces and on, we'd get to see this guy in all of his short-quilled glory. Yeah, this model is mostly the same, but they opted to shorten his quills for whatever reason. A really weird design choice, since his debut game is one that literally features classic Sonic. You know, the one with shorter quills. I don't know, if you want to differentiate these two, who are already pretty similar, I'd say that keeping their unique proportions is the best way to do that, right? But what do I know? It's not like I make games or anything. Hey, by the way, make sure to wishlist my game Star Garden on Steam. Thanks. One thing that's kind of neat is that they rearranged his middle quill so that at a side profile view, he keeps his 3-quill silhouette. Pretty cool, to be honest. Not a fan of the shorter quills, but it's still at the very least a serviceable model. This one is going into the same tier as its predecessor, into the C tier. Alright, one more classic Sonic model. We've got this adorable little guy from Sonic Superstars. He's kind of just a even softer looking Generations classic Sonic. His face looks a little bit more refined, but has some of the same issues as the previous model. He's a bit short, he's a bit chubby, and he really has no edge to him. Overall though, this is a slight step up, so I think I'm going to place it on a tier higher at the B tier. And that's every notable 3D Sonic model ranked. So which one is my favorite of all time? Obviously something in S tier, right? Well, let's just say this model is kind of in a category of its own. It isn't even on the tier list yet because it's actually unofficial. Meet the Acania Sonic model. This model is from a mod of Super Smash Bros. Melee called the Acania build, which adds some extra characters to the game, one of them including Sonic. This guy looks like he was ripped straight out of the Adventure CGI opening cutscene. He's complete, authentic Adventure Sonic. They did such a good job with this model, with the shapes, proportions, and textures. And out of every model on this list, this guy follows circle theory the most flawless I've seen yet. Every single facial feature aligns perfectly with these goddamn circles. He's just so cool looking. Gosh, I could just gush about this model all day. So yeah, this is my absolute favorite Sonic model of all time. Please go play this mod and take in this model in all of its GameCube era glory. Okay, bye.